While retirement is generally seen as a time of relaxation and self-focus, God calls us to love, serve, and help others for a lifetime. He has been preparing us for this retirement season, literally our entire lives. In retirement, countless Christians enter a state of spiritual dormancy, not knowing how they are called to have an impact for God's kingdom. The Retirement Reformation seeks to encourage and empower the 50 million Christians approaching or in retirement to embrace the calling God has been preparing in them. When the world says it's time to stop, you can begin to have your greatest impact. Welcome to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation, where our goal is to journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him.
Reaching out to the 50 million Christ followers in America who are approaching or already in retirement, you've tuned into iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and of course, we're joined by the founder of the Retirement Reformation, Bruinsma. We invite you to check us out online, retirementreformation.org, and of course, on Facebook under Retirement Reformation. Retirement. The process of prepping for and entering into retirement is daunting, to say the least. So many possibilities, so many ways to get it all wrong. Is there really a wrong? As we've said so many times on this podcast, many retirees know what they're retiring from, but very few, very few know what they're retiring to. How can you make sure you're prepared for what's ahead? Bruinsma is here today to lend some advice as we begin our three-part series, Questions for Prepping for Retirement. Today, we're going to focus on 7 questions we must answer in order to be prepared for retirement. Bruinsma, welcome back to iRetire4Him.
Jim, it's so good to be with you, and I'm looking forward to dealing with these 7 questions. It's number 7 is a key number in the Christian historicity, and so these 7 questions will be ones that you'll want to. Matter of fact, let me suggest to our audience: go get a notebook, because you're going to want to take some notes today.
Or your iPad, if you're a little younger and you want to take notes on your iPad, or your iPhone, whatever it might be. So Bruce, why is it important that we ask ourselves questions before we head into retirement?
Well, as you said in your introduction, there are so many people that know what they're retiring from, but have little idea of what they're retiring to. So how do you enter into the conversation with yourself, with your spouse, family perhaps, to be able to answer the question, what am I retiring to? And we know that in order to answer that question, there are these 7 choices that you can make. And once you make those, you will then be able to enter into a meaningful thought process, planning process, discussion, and an action plan.
All right, so what is the number one question we should ask before we enter into retirement?
When you sit back and you think about the retirement that's coming up, or perhaps the next stage of retirement that's coming up, to really start at a 30,000 foot level and ask a very basic question: what's really important to me? And when you start to take that apart of what is important to me, that will take you down the various trails that are part of the upcoming questions that we will address, but will start to give you a guideline of how God is shaping your thinking about what is next and what you're retiring to. So, for example, what are the desires that you have that God has put in you? What is it that you just feel, I need to do that? What are the passions that God has built into you? What is it that I react to? And as I've said often, when someone says to me, well, how do I know what I'm passionate about? It's, what is it that makes you cry? What is it that kind of chokes you up? I'm a much more emotional guy than most people think. And Jim, on these, in our podcast, quite often we will have a subject or a topic, and I really get choked up about it. We just had one in a conversation we had with a wonderful lady from the Netherlands. But the topic that she has really, really gets me. I was really passionate about that.
Right.
So what are our desires? What are our passions? And then starting to sort through those and say then, okay, what are my priorities? And when you address that part of what is important to you, that starts to give you the boundaries within which God will direct the rest of your life.
So do we need to ask these just before we enter into retirement, or do we need to ask them again in the middle of retirement as well? I mean, do we need to ask these questions more than once?
Yeah, of course, it's more than once. When you're entering into retirement, when you're moving from stage 1 to stage 2 of retirement, usually in your late 70s and in that period of time, and then in your late 80s one more time, and maybe in the middle of it also, because there are so many needs and there are so many opportunities that once we get away from the disease of nothing and we move into what is it that God's got planned for us, these questions continue to become priorities. Let's just think back to the 40 years of Moses, and so God gave him the direction, and he had his questions very much up front when he went to see Pharaoh, but had to continue to refine those as the circumstances changed over the next 40 years. And each one of us has that same both need and opportunity.
So that reflection needs to happen often. All right. So if the first question is, what's most important to you in retirement regarding your desires, your passions, your priorities, what's the next question we should ask ourselves?
It's really interesting. It's one that before I really became engaged in this topic and really understanding where people were, I would have put this next question much further down on the list. It's right at the top of the list because it has to do with what is our transition going to look like? And here's the question: where are we going to live? As a matter of fact, I suggest to those that are in their 50s and perhaps early 60s that one of the best things you can do is grab your spouse's hand and go for a walk or dinner or wherever it is where you really talk and just ask the question, where do you think we ought to live? My goodness gracious. That brings up so many issues, some that are been buried and need to come to the surface, some that will be surprising. And probably the most important part of the answer to that question is that whatever your answer is for next, it is only the next step, and you will ask that question again. Because wherever it is that you decide to live, you may not live there for the rest of your life. Things change, times change, you change. But that question of where are we going to live and coming together in unity is what our next step is going to be is really important.
Well, my encouragement to you as you're thinking about where you're going to live, just remember, there's already plenty of chronologically superior people in Arizona, Texas, and Florida. We need you right where you're at, where your family is, where there's families that are younger than you, where you could pour your life into them. Don't move away to being with a bunch of people that are 55 plus. We need you in the society. All right. What question should we ask ourselves, Bruce, that helps us connect with our Heavenly Father in this process?
You know, the bottom line process is to be connected with God's plan for your life. And so the question becomes, are you connected with God's plan for your life? And that starts with just realizing, do you acknowledge that He has one?
Wow.
There's number one.
Wow. That's a great one. Do you acknowledge that He actually has a plan for your life? When Bruce and I come back in the third segment, we're going to finish up this conversation of the 7 questions that you need to ask yourself before you get into retirement so you're prepared, well prepared. You're listening to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. When we come back, you're going to hear from a very special guest. We'll be right back.
The Retirement Reformation wants to come alongside you as you navigate in each stage of your retirement. Our online resources include our blog, our downloadable books, and life planning studies, as well as membership and coaching options. Go to retirementreformation.org and use these resources to begin the transformation of your retirement. Journey from retirement to reformation, so you can say, I retire for Him. That's retirementreformation.org. Now, back to the show.
Hey, welcome back to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. Bruce, during every second segment of our podcast, you bring on a special guest, in order to have them share their story of them living out their life during their quote-unquote retirement years. Who do you have for us today?
I've got a special guest today that was introduced to us by Elliot Ennis, our Director of Operations for Retirement Reformation, and he always has good choices. And so, Dr. Marlene Bizub, is that right? I've got
Correct.
it.
That's correct.
All right, I've got it. And if you can handle Bruinsma, we're all in good shape. We just appreciate your being on today. You have an impressive background, and just give us a quick introduction into who you are and what God's have been having you to do, and then we can talk about what's next.
Oh, I would love to share this. So the first court case I ever did, afterwards I said never again. And then I quickly realized that God placed me there for a reason. I'm a child of divorce. I've been divorced as an adult, which I don't believe in, but it happens to the best of us. And so I realized that all those things that had happened in my life perfectly prepared me for work in the courts. I was in court even this morning on a case, and it's a brutal place to be. It really is. But if we don't have God there, and it's a challenge because you can't openly talk about faith and religion in court because of the separation. And I know somebody told me I don't tell this right, but the separation of church and state. So I have to be really careful, but you can believe that God's presence is there when I'm there.
So when you are in the process of being an expert in the midst of all the chaos, and if you look deep into yourself, what is the desired outcome that God has put inside of you that if that happens, man, that's a 10?
A peaceful situation for the kids.
Uh,
Parents who can co-parent, if not peacefully, at least not contentiously, that they can at least maintain some level of civility, and especially around their children. If I can get them to not display whatever they're feeling, anger, resentment, betrayal, possibly, whatever they're feeling, and not express it in front of their children, that's a win.
that's wonderful. And you've been doing this for a long time.
A long time. Yes, about 20, 27 years.
So how in the world are you able to maintain that beautiful smile and a positive attitude in the midst of all that chaos?
I think just knowing that kids need somebody there for them, the kids keep me going. The parents, I hate to say, certainly do not, but the kids do for sure.
We know that in the work that we do with older people, that in fact they could play a much more active and positive role should they choose to do so in these circumstances and lots of others. Do you see much interaction between, the role of, I'll just say grandparents, but of older people in the lives
Let's call them chronologically superior, Bruce. Let's not call them older. Chronologically superior.
Yeah, I always think, I guess my ego can handle that one. But do you see much of that kind of an interaction taking place?
Yes, I do. And the best way I describe the role of grandparents in my cases, I get step parents who can either be my greatest asset on the case or my biggest problem. But grandparents, almost 95% of the time, are a solid resource for the children. They're there for the children. I think they have enough maturity, by the time they get to be grandparents.
Yeah.
They know how to protect kids through this, whereas some step parents still don't, and some parents still don't. But the grandparents, they play a vital role because they are often that go-to person for the kids when they're in the middle of all this conflict.
I think the ability to both identify and encourage grandparents and older people to actively take a role in the lives of those who are hurting and chaos and come alongside people like yourself Did you have a particular story that you'd like to share with us as we kind of get towards the end of our interview?
Yes. People ask me all the time if I'm thinking about retiring. You must be getting close to that time that you're thinking about that. And I have to tell you, retiring doesn't enter my mind other than when people ask me about it. But I don't think about retiring because when you love the work you do, when you have a passion for the work you do, it's not work. It's not something you need to retire from. I had someone ask me the other day, and it was a good question, and I think a legitimate question. They said, if you had 8 to 5 hours, would you still feel that way? Probably not. I mean, I've got the advantage or benefit of being able to set my own schedule, but I just can't imagine ever not wanting to help these kids in these cases.
When you found that meaning and purpose, that makes all the difference. I was hearing someone say the other day, who has a nonprofit organization that deals with kids, and they were asking, what advice would you have? And her comment was this. Her comment was, find something you're passionate about, rip off a piece, and get started on it.
Yeah.
And I just thought, boy, you represent that. You don't have to rip off anything. You're right in the middle of it. And so that to you. Jim, do you have any questions?
I do. Marlene, this is a show talking to iRetire4Him is a podcast focused on people that are pre-retiring or already in retirement.
Yes.
And I imagine, just based on my experience a little bit in the foster system, because I've got all three of my kids are involved in fostering, is that it seems like there's a need for more volunteers in the court system overall. And you got a lot of retirees today listening to the show that are going, I want purpose. And Marlene seems like she's super excited. She's still working full time, and you're of retirement age. I'm not going to disclose how old that is, but there's people that are listening going, could I help? Could I help in any way? How could our listeners help you?
The place I would tell them to go is CASA, Court Appointed Special Advocates, CASA. And I'm actually going there tonight to teach a co-parenting class for the court. But CASA they utilize volunteers in their foster care cases. And so there is a big need. And I know over the past couple of years with the pandemic and everything, I know they're short on volunteers. So I would have people call CASA.
Very good. We will look up that information and put it on our website.
Yeah,
and so
I just love that sign behind it. Love your children more than you hate your ex.
Yes.
And as Jesus followers, there's no room for hate anywhere. And obviously in divorce, there's never an easy divorce. Divorce is a gift that just keeps on giving and giving and giving in so many cases. But there's some great organizations out there in case people are listening going, yeah, but I don't know how to deal with my kid's divorce. I didn't get divorced, but I don't know how to deal with my own divorce. We've interviewed some people in the past. SmartStepFamilies.com is a great website to go to get some resources. But Marlene, in closing out today, speak to those people who are pre-retiring or already retired that are wondering, how can they be an asset to their children whose marriages are struggling? Because it's so easy to take the side of your biological child, yet your grandchildren are your biological children. Give some advice, some things you've seen grandparents do that you would not recommend repeating, and some things you'd like to see that you'd like to have more grandparents repeat.
Yes. Well, like I said, most of the time, the vast majority of the time, grandparents are a positive asset. For the grandkids, I would say just listen. Just listen. Don't try to give them advice or tell them what to do or, that type of thing. Just listen. For their adult children, I believe it's okay to say on here, direct them to the Bible. Our pastor actually is doing a series right now on marriage. And divorce, of course, is rarely biblical. And I say rarely because there are a couple of exceptions in the Bible. But it's not going to be easier with the next person. And there's statistics that show if you get divorced once, you'll get divorced again. And so direct them back to the Bible, to therapists that work with people on marriages and things like that.
Yeah, and it was Dobson years and years ago. Bruce, you probably remember this, when he came out and they did a study. And people that were in crisis in their marriage and they decided to get divorced, 5 years later, they wish they hadn't.
Yes.
And those that stayed married 5 years later had the best marriage they ever had because they worked on it. And it is marriage is hard work, but divorce is harder work. Marlene, you've seen that. And as grandparents of kids who've gotten divorced, it's like skating on a thin edge, trying to make sure that you can stay in touch with those grandkids as marriages break off. It's a full-time ministry, but I appreciate you just sharing your story today and just a little bit of it. But how many more years you think you got in you? I mean, you think you could do this till the day you're done?
Probably. I mean, as long as my health permits, I will do this until I can.
That's fantastic.
That's good. I'm glad. Thank you. We're so pleased we have people, like you are doing that. And as a friend of mine often says, isn't it amazing? Wherever you go, you bring yourself along with it.
Yes.
Dr.
Marlene, thank you so much for your time today. We'll look forward to our next connection. And, God bless the work that you're doing. And may you maintain that emotional strength that it needs to be able to make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to iRetire4Him. We'll be right back. Every iRetire4Him show goes so quickly, we don't often get to remind you that there are 2 resources you should be checking out right now. I recommend that you get a copy of the Retirement Reformation book and the iRetire4Him book. Retirement Reformation focuses on the mindset and behavioral changes needed, let's just say paradigm shifting, that is needed to live out your faith in retirement. iRetire4Him is focused on many of the ways you can put your faith into action by investing your life into others in your retirement years. Get both at the Retirement Reformation website in the bookstore, retirementreformation.org. That's retirementreformation.org. Hey, welcome back to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece for the Retirement Reformation. We're talking today about 7 questions you should ask yourself as you prepare for retirement. First one is, what's most important to you in retirement? About your desires, your passions, your priorities. Where will you live? And are you connected to the unique plan God has for you? Bruce, we still got 4 more questions, but only 8 more minutes. When we're talking about the questions that we need to ask before we head into retirement, things we need to decide in advance, what's your next question?
Well, the next question is this, and we could spend a whole hour on being connected with God in that process. So
yeah, absolutely.
Connect with Retirement Reformation ORG to help you walk down that pathway. So here's an interesting question, and question number 4. Who do you want to love?
Yeah, what do you mean by that? Because when I was preparing, I'm like, what do you mean?
Well, for example, do you want to spend most of your time in relationship with your children? There's a driver upon where we live and what we do. I want to love on them. Secondly, God may be calling you to love on the orphans of Ethiopia. And so that's going to change that direction of where you're going to be. Perhaps the opportunity to love veterans, to love the disabled. Who is it that God is making a priority in your life? It doesn't mean that you're going to not pay any attention to everyone else, but where is it that internal love mechanism really needs to go to work? And it's fascinating if you'll ask yourself that question and you and your spouse talk about it, you'll be surprised at some of the answers that will come out of it that you hadn't either thought about or hadn't expected.
And it'll give you some direction to answer some more of the other questions.
Absolutely.
All right. So many of us are worried if our finances will carry us through the end of our lives. What's a good question to ask here?
Well, the basic question, I think in its most simple form, is will you have enough? And at some level, we all understand what enough means. However, when we think about it, that our retirement years may be 30, we're faced with things like inflation today. And so when we say we have enough, what's really behind that? Will there be sufficient resources to be able to respond to God's call on your life, to be able to respond to where He wants you to go, what He wants you to do, how generous He wants you to be, and with whom He wants you to be generous? And so having enough has, again, a whole series of different components to it. But the key is that are there enough resources that in fact your stewardship can overflow to others.
And that's just, I love the fact that you put in there your generosity, to plan your generosity. Because in my opinion, one of the things I don't want to do is to dump a bunch of money on my kids when I die. I want to be able to start teaching them how to handle their inheritance long before I go. All right, so what questions should we be asking when it comes to making sure that we're still improving as a person, even in retirement?
You know, and I think playing off the words you just used, even in retirement, I think therein lays an issue. That what I have found is that during my retirement years, although obviously very active, I think I learn more every year about myself and about my relationships, about things I do well, things I do terrible, things that I can change, that whole area of generosity. There are all these areas that open up, and so that our personal growth continues. Because if we stop growing, well, what are we?
We're dying if we stop growing.
Exactly.
So the question is, where are you on your personal growth journey?
Exactly the question.
Yeah.
So that is the next to the last question of where are you on your personal growth journey? And the answers to the prior questions will also help inform the answers to that question because they're all integrated.
Bruce, take a minute to get a little personal with that one. On your personal growth journey, how have you made sure, and this isn't a spiritual growth journey, we're going to deal with that in one of the other podcasts here in our 3-part series, but personally, how are you making sure that you're still growing and expanding and becoming a better person in your retirement years, even though you really haven't retired, but in your retirement years?
Well, one of the guiding lights that is still unraveling for me is how, in fact, do the fruits of the Spirit, how are they reflected in my life? How are they reflected? And so as I counsel with people, as I mentor with people, and then I look at the issues in my own life to remember that it's the lens of the fruits of the Spirit that guide me often to different answers than Bruce Bruinsma would come to all by himself. And that's the Holy Spirit speaking to us. And so the lens of the fruits of the Spirit are the pieces to the puzzle. So I can ask myself, where am I in my love journey? Who am I not loving? Or who am I not loving enough? Love what? What comes next? Joy, peace, patience, kindness, gentleness, self-control, generosity. I got 8 things that as I look through my life with those lenses, I continue to find areas of things I don't know anything about.
Right.
And things that I don't reflect in my life. And so that personal growth journey, by reading, by looking for other examples, by investigating things that come in front of me and say, I don't know anything about that. That's interesting. Let me go find out. One little story to illustrate that. Our son Brent is challenged, special needs. And he has a set of encyclopedia. One of the wonderful things is that he can read. And so whenever I'm talking with him and we're talking about something that he doesn't know anything about, I say to him, Brent, go look that up in the encyclopedia and we'll talk about that the next time we do. He does. He goes and he reads about it. And the next time we talk, I say, Brent, what did you learn when you read about this subject in the encyclopedia? Oh, Dad, I learned a lot.
That's great.
Can't we all?
All right. We're talking the 7 questions we need to answer before we head into retirement. The first one is, what's the most important to you in retirement? Your desires, your passions, your priorities. Where will you live? Are you connected to the unique plan God has for you? Who do you want to love? Will you have enough? Where are you on your personal growth journey? And finally, Bruce, before we come to an end of this podcast, life in retirement comes with uncertainties. Well, it doesn't come with certainties. It comes certainly with uncertainties, except that the only certainty is that we'll end in our passing. What question helps us to deal with those uncertainties?
I think most of us can identify at least some of what I call the special issues of life. It could be a special, in my case, I just talked about Brent. That is a special issue in our life that we have to take into account. So what are the special issues? So it may be a relationship issue. It may be a financial issue. It may be a next step in a career issue. I'm 81 now. I've got a transition period coming up here in the next year or two. Now I got to decide what are the next years going to look like. And so we have health. There's another one. Relationship with your spouse. Relationship with your kids. What are the special issues that you have to take into account as you pray, think about, and be prepared to step into retirement or into the next stage of retirement?
And just to be able to plan on living day by day and not living, it's great to plan for those 30 years, but to recognize that you don't know whether you have tomorrow or not. So make the most of today. Bruce, great conversation about 7 questions that we absolutely need to deal with before we enter into retirement. Good conversation today, Bruce.
Thanks, Jim.
You've been listening
They're
to
important questions.
Yeah, they are. Absolutely very important questions. You've been listening to iRetire4Him, the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation, with your host, Jim Brangenberg, and of course, Retirement Reformation's own founder, Bruce Bruinsma. We're Christ followers journeying from just the idea of retirement to reformation, so we can ultimately say, I retire for him.
Retire for him.
Thanks for listening to I Retire for Him with your hosts, Jim and Martha Brangenberg, and Retirement Reformation founder, Bruce Bruinsma. I Retire for Him is the mouthpiece of the Retirement Reformation. Most Christians tend to follow the world's pattern of rest and self-pampering during retirement. However, in your retirement, you can be focused on God's unique call to love, serve, and help others. This can be your best season of life if you take advantage of a life's worth of knowledge and experience and combine it with a greater freedom of time and money and invest it all in the generations both preceding and following you. The Retirement Reformation is encouraging Christians to find and follow God's call in all seasons and aspects of life, especially in retirement. Take time to sign the manifesto at retirementreformation.org and explore the wealth of resources available on our site. Join this movement of God and journey from retirement to reformation so you can say, I retire for Him. Go to retirementreformation.org.